Hi everyone, welcome to Young People Leading Peace and Connection. So this session is about divisions in our society and how those are dividing us and potentially leading to violence and exclusion. We're going to be looking at how young people are taking action to build social connection and respectful relationships and how we support them to do that. My name's Cass Prig. I'm the MC for this session, and I want to share a content warning that this discussion may include some references to violence. The format of this session is that we will have several speakers take turns to speak about their work, and then we will have a Q&A at the end. During the session, you can submit questions via the Q&A function in this Zoom webinar. And now I'd like to introduce Thomas Feng, who is the Media and Communications Manager at YACVic, who will be moderating this session. Thomas is YACVic's quirky and diligent Media and Comms Manager, who translates complex issues into compelling stories when he isn't sending emails to all of you about how to access Hopin. If you can hear some coughing and snoring in the background, I've got my two dogs with me on the couch, so that's what that is. Thomas is particularly passionate about helping diverse and marginalised voices reach the mainstream. He's had notable roles across the University of Melbourne, Road to Refuge, and the Centre for Multicultural Youth, as well as Oak Tree and other community-led spaces. So I'll hand over to Thomas. Thanks.
Thanks, Cass, for that warm introduction. Thomas speaking. I'm Thomas. I use he, him pronouns, and I want to acknowledge that I'm calling in from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, pay my respect to the elders past and present, and acknowledge that the ongoing effects of colonisation and the genocide of First Nations people has impacted the world and Australia's ability to create peace, social connection, and equity. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm honoured to be moderating today's session on young people leading peace and connection. Before I begin, just want to reiterate a content warning that we'll be referencing racism, violence, and sexism in this session. And if you need support or if you start to feel unsafe, please contact one of our friendly YACVic support staff, and we'll also put in the appropriate services to refer to you in the chat as well. We live in an increasingly united but polarised and divided world. We've seen global events shake up the way we see each other and our community. In Australia, we've seen fierce young women in Grace Tame and Brittany Higgins stand up to sexism and gendered violence. Across the world, it's young people leading action on Black Lives Matter in the footsteps of their elders, calling for change. As a Chinese Australian young person, COVID-19 has brought out the best and worst in the community, increased daily racism, social isolation, as well as a groundswell of community support. Social media has also brought upon new ways of connection and changed the way that young people organise and how we think about the concept of community. So I'm hoping today's session brings hope, optimism, and unpacks how we come together and build connection in a time when we physically cannot come together. You'll take lessons from each of our speakers whom I'll introduce now. Sergio Pelas, who's the co-chair of the UN Global Coalition on Youth, Peace and Security and director at Search for Common Ground. Ofeira Satele, the Youth Project Coordinator at Know Your Roots at the Points of Difference studio in Shepparton. And Zoe Condliffe, the CEO and founder of She's a Crowd and researcher at Monash University. It's going to be an amazing session, and I'm going to hand it straight over to Saji. So I'll introduce Saji again. So Saji has over 20 years experience working with youth movements in conflict and transition environments in over 35 countries. As the co-chair of the Global Coalition on Youth, Peace and Security, he co-led successful advocacy for the UN Security Council Resolution 2250, which says that young people play an important and positive role in the maintenance and promotion of international peace and security. Saji is also the Director of Children and Youth Programs at Search for Common Ground and has received the Distinguished Luxembourg Peace Prize for his outstanding achievements in peace support and obtained his master's degree in international peace and conflict resolution from American University in Washington, DC. We are so honoured to have you, Saji. So the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you so much, Thomas, for that beautiful introduction. Very generous of you and kind of you. Thank you. And And also thank you for inviting me to be part of this very important conversation that you're hosting online. I'm really honored to be here. Originally, my name is Saji Prelis, he and him are my pronouns, but I want to take a little sidestep in my presentation with you today and tell you where I come from as well. I'm originally from Sri Lanka, a country I grew up in, where I witnessed the horrors of war shaking people's daily lives. What I witnessed as a young boy growing up was seeing the really ugly side of human nature, where we saw people killing each other in brutal ways. But at the same time, grew up seeing the beautiful side of human nature, people risking their own life, risking their own credibility and stature and reputation to save somebody who is considered an enemy. So I was really confused. Why are people able to do so much evil and at the same time do so much good? And that led me to try to study this and understand this. So as I grew up in Sri Lanka, I'm paying respect to all the people who helped shape who I am today and shape the narratives of a positive culture in Sri Lanka. I'm going to focus on, first, talk a little bit about why young people matter internationally. So I'm going to zoom out of Australia and think more globally about this. Around the world, we have 8+ billion people, and over 2 billion or so are considered young in the world. When you look at large continents around the world, like the continent of Africa, the continent's median age is about 19 years of age. Countries within the continent, the median age in some countries, the youngest countries with the home to the youngest populations, 14 and 15 years is the median age. So you take a step back and ask, these young people are a majority in the countries. About 1 in 4 people around the world, young people around the world, are affected by violence and conflict. This was a few years back. Now with the pandemic, this has taken a very different perspective. We know also that about 60% of the population in less than 10 years will be below the age of 18 in urban settings around the world. So this idea of engaging and understanding young people is not just a demographic reality we need to tackle with, but a democratic opportunity to embrace as well. And I want to shift this, building on this understanding of why young people, I want to talk a little bit about why we've shaped an agenda that we now call the Youth, Peace and Security Agenda. For many years, this youth bulge, this youth population in many of these countries was seen in a binary way. Either them seen as victims of conflict or seeing them as troublemakers in conflict situations. And it was based on a policy panic that didn't really understand who this population is. At the same time, as Thomas so eloquently also articulated, the world is changing so dramatically today. One of the things that is changing is trust. Trust we the people have with we the institutions, whether they are governments or private sector or the international NGO community or international organizations. Trust in these institutions is diminishing on a rapid scale. Young people who are in the midst of this, who have lost faith in or losing faith in these institutions, have started writing a new story. They have articulated that while governments using a policy panic see young people as troublemakers and victims, there's so much more, and have created a narrative that forced the international community to embrace this partnership model. And this partnership model is based on the fundamental new question. In conflict settings, the questions that galvanized this policy panic was, why are young people joining armed groups, gangs, cults? Why are young people doing drugs and all these things that take you, sometimes are good questions to ask, but young people articulated that that's the wrong question to start with. That's not the first question, even though that was the first question that people asked. We say, we need to ask a new question. The new question that the international community was forced to ask was, why are most young people peaceful? Think about that. Instead of getting down a rabbit hole of asking, why are young people joining armed groups? Why are young people dealing with drugs? The new disruptive question was, why are most young people peaceful? That question was the guiding light for what we call the Youth, Peace and Security Agenda that came because of young people from over 110 countries who said enough with our binary narrative of young people as troublemakers and victims to seeing us as partners. That advocacy led to what Thomas introduced in 2015, December 9th, the first UN Security Council resolution 2250 that recognized the partnership elements of young people who are important partners in shaping peace and democracy and governance issues and not just being seen as victims. That was followed in 2018 by the second resolution, the resolution 2419. There, it articulated a vision of how young people need to be seen as partners in peace processes. Peace processes oftentimes mediated by governments, men in power usually, and men with guns or rebel group leaders. And what the second resolution was calling for is young people need to be part of shaping what that peace agreement should look like, because otherwise they are the ones inheriting these bad deals that are negotiated, because it falls on the backs, the laps and shoulders of young people to carry forward these bad deals. So the Security Council recognized that and acknowledged the importance of young people shaping peace processes also. A third resolution came up in 2020. And this one, among many things, for the first time recognized this civic space young people occupy is rapidly shrinking. And because of their unique age and the way they interact in the world, their access is completely coming under stress. So this resolution called for the protection and safeguarding of civic spaces young people occupy, civic spaces that are physical and digital. What it did collectively with these three resolutions, it gave oxygen to over 500 to 600 million young people around the world who are in the front lines of preventing violence. Recognize them as critical agents in these efforts. Before that, they were in the sidelines. Now they're in the front lines and acknowledge the frontline recognition that they deserve. I want to shift now based on that foundation. What is coming up next in this field of youth, peace, and security itself? One is we are in the process of developing guidelines for governments around the world of how to engage young people as partners in peace and security efforts. We realize that peace and security doesn't mean that the country has to be in war. We recognize the exclusion that happens in everyday life of the people. So we've been thinking about the guidance for governments in a holistic way and an inclusive way. We're going to be launching them in Doha, Qatar next year, which is proposed at a conference where presidents and prime ministers are invited to from over 30 to 40 countries. And the conference is co-sponsored by government of Qatar, Colombia, and Finland. At this conference, we are launching the national guidance for governments. Second output that is coming at the conference is a 5-year roadmap on how to strengthen the role young people play in peace processes. As I speak with you today, in Afghanistan, young people are completely sidelined by the process that has been going on for over 40 years in the country. And the young people the median age in the country is 18.5 years. And are they in any conversation? No. So this is why the role young people play in peace processes matter. And over the next 5 years, we are committing to a collective effort to shape this field itself. And the third is around protection of civic spaces. We realize that protecting civic spaces is so fundamental. And we see that on televisions around the world, whether it's in New York, in the main streets of the United States or in Nigeria, perpetrators are being seen as the police, seeing young people as perpetrators. Young people see police as perpetrators. So the civic space is being challenged by young people because of their expressions. And we are coming up with a global strategy of how to strengthen our collective accountability to young people in this process. And the last thing is around financing this youth leadership. Where young people act in this world needs to be not only recognized, but equally financed. Financing requires us to think differently about how we actually finance their leadership. We cannot use the same traditional model that has very deep colonial roots and racist roots to say that we can invest in young people in the same way. We cannot afford to do that anymore. And in that light, we've launched a global fund, the global fund that is owned by young people in different parts of the world. They are not recipients of money, but investors in the fund also. And I'll share the links with you from some of these things I'm talking about, so you get to understand this a little bit more. As I wind down, I want to share with you 4 key suggestions as I think looking at countries around the world. One is we recognize that young people live very translocal lives. Ask yourself, in the last week alone, how many people did you interact with in your own city versus online? More and more people are interacting with peers online than in their own neighborhoods. So this question about the nation state also is a question that we need to unpack because of the world we are going to be living in. Second is ensuring that there are stronger on-ramps and opportunities for young people to participate in issues. And here, we have to pay special attention to young people of color, young people of immigrant backgrounds, to make sure that they are not left behind. It is important that the on-ramps for them meet them where they are at, not create something foreign or different. Third, when you see what we see from around the world, it's important to make people feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves. The military does a really good job at this. We see violent groups sometimes and gangs do a really good job at this, making people feel that they are part of something bigger and there's a purpose behind that work. As civil society actors, we need to think of how our work makes people that is co-created with young people is part of something bigger also. Fifth is this financing thing. I'm not suggesting that money is a solution to all problems. What I'm suggesting is money gives people power. And we need to make sure that power comes with less strings attached and the barriers to enter and access that financing has to be removed a lot more. So as we think about the next generation of practice, when it comes to social cohesion, understanding young people as partners is a fundamental principle that is now enshrined in international law. Governments and states within countries need to look at different ways. And I think I'm leading this conversation, but there are 2 amazing speakers who are going to give you much more rich a look at what that looks like. So with that, I want to say thank you again for inviting me. And it's a real honor to be part of this conversation. Thank you so much. Over to you, Thomas.
Thanks so much, Saji. Thank you for sharing your wealth of knowledge and expertise. Some really great reflections from challenging binary narratives, from victims and troublemakers to partners. And I think you've done that in a variety of spaces, and also some really great reflections on youth participation more broadly in the context of social cohesion. So from the global heights of the UN, we're going grassroots to Greater Shepparton to Fairer Satele from Know Your Roots. Fairer moved back from New Zealand to Australia when her family finally settled in the Greater Shepparton area in 2011. Fairer's roots are deep in the villages of Whalase'ala, Tafangangu Manu, and Lefanga, and has a passion for her Samoan heritage. She was one of the first young people to participate in the Know Your Roots program when it was established in 2016, and for the last 5 years has been their dedicated youth coordinator for the Know Your Roots program and Pacifica Festival. Ofeira has many dreams ahead of her and is currently completing her diploma in community services whilst working full-time for the Ethnic Council of Shepparton and District. Thanks so much, Ofeira, for making time, and we can't wait to hear from you. The floor is yours.
Hello, Talofalava, everyone. Before I start, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered on today, the Yorta Yorta and Bangarang people. I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. My name is Ofeira Satele, and my pronouns are she/her. I'm 22 years of age and am of Samoan descent. I live in regional Victoria in the Greater Shepparton region, and I'm here today representing the Know Your Roots Incorporation and the Point of Difference studio. So KYR Pod is a not-for-profit organization that aims to create culturally safe, respectful, and accessible environments in rural regional Victoria. We are committed to promoting the importance of defining one's identity, cultural intelligence, fairness, and belonging. The values that we base our presence on is respect in how we choose to speak and act towards all as passed down by our ancestors. Equity, where we hear and see each other's need and commit to fairness and loyalty, which is unconditional, and we are committed to our communities. My role here at KYR is as a youth coordinator. Although my title may limit me to working with just the youth, we aim to work with all support teams of our youth, from school, community to families, whatever. I just want to talk a little bit about an incident that happened earlier this year, which had involved our students of color. It was a school brawl between our students where we had ethnic kids fighting other ethnic students. Although we might not have been able to prevent the brawl from happening, we did a lot of debriefing and consultations with not just the students, but their communities, their schools, and most of all, their families. For us colored people, there seems to be this fear in facing our parents and families when we get into this kind of trouble and when we create these troubles, because of the discipline that we face and also the sacrifices that our families and our ancestors before us have made to get us out here for better living, better education, and better opportunities. We've come to this theory that the challenges we face, we can find the solutions within our communities and within our families. We had consultations with our families and worked alongside the school and the students to create solutions. We always aim to listen and hear what they have to say. It's not rocket science. Our students are, they're able to identify problems and acknowledge that they played a part in that problem. But most importantly, they're also part of the solutions that we had come up with. We had families reach out to us. We were able to see raw emotions from families. We had to hear parents cry and ask for help with their kids and their families. It really does take a village to raise a child, and we can only do this by working side by side with all the team players, whether it be the students, the school, communities, families, all of that. And there's just this Samoan proverb which says, "E fofo le alemea le alamea," which is viewed as solutions for issues and challenges affecting a community can be found within that same community. Everyone here at the pod, the Point of Difference studio, they're volunteering professionals. Our youth mentors and programs are delivered by professionals who come from different walks of life and serve freely and passionately. Our communities and the future of our young people are at the forefront of what we do and how we serve. There's also this other proverb in Samoan, which is ole ala i le pule o le tautua, which translates to the road to leadership is through service. And we will always continue to work with them, not above them, but always beside them. We are community working for community within community. We're always here, although we get paid from 9 to 5, any hour we're needed, we will be there. 25/8, that's what we live on. So yeah, that's all from me. Just like to thank everyone for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ofeira. That was incredible. Really speaking from the heart, and I think some really, really important reflections, and also bringing out exactly kind of what Saji was talking about, away from this idea of this binary narrative around victims and troublemakers, but partners and collaborators in determining the solutions that work for community. I also really love the proverb, solutions for issues and community can be found within that community. Really, really amazing presentation. Thanks so much, Ofeira. Now we're gonna take a look at gender-based violence. So I'm gonna hand it over to Zoe Condliffe. Zoe Condliffe is the CEO and founder of She's a Crowd. And she's a researcher in gender and crowdsourcing technology at Monash University, using crowdsourcing technology to make cities safer for women and address gender-based violence. The floor is yours. Thanks, Zoe.
Thanks, Thomas. Hi, everybody. I'm calling in from the Illawarra, and I want to begin by paying my respects to the traditional owners here, the people of the Dharawal Nation. Sovereignty has never been ceded in so-called Australia, and this was and always will be Aboriginal land. I am located near Thirroul, actually, which is south of Sydney, and I found out recently that Thirroul is derived from an Indigenous word meaning the valley of the cabbage leaf palms. So my name's Zoe, and I use she, her pronouns, and I have medium length brown hair and green eyes. I'm wearing glasses, gold earrings, and a navy blue dress and chunky white sneakers, which no one actually can see, but you know what? They're really cute. So I thought I'd share that anyway. I'm the founder and CEO of She's a Crowd. We use crowdsourced data to make cities safer for women and non-binary people and close the gender data gap. So I'll be discussing sexual assault and gender-based violence today. So I wanted to also offer a content warning, and if you need to step away, please feel free to. So people do often ask me why I started She's a Crowd. It's usually the first question that people ask. So I thought I'd talk about that today. And for me, the answer is very personal. Like most women, I am a survivor of sexual assault and gender-based violence. But before I became, a victim or a survivor, I was an entrepreneur. I started my first social enterprise when I was 21. I was always very passionate about doing something that hadn't already been done. And that's always been my driving force. I found that it came quite naturally to me, and I was always driven to learn and experience as much of everything as soon as I could. And that happens to come hand in hand with social entrepreneurship. So when I was 20 years old, before there were actually accelerator programs around in Australia, I was accepted into a program called the School for Social Entrepreneurs. As the youngest person in that program, I felt a huge sense of imposter syndrome. But I remember three main aspects, three main kind of pieces of advice that I got, which I think about all the time. And I thought I'd take this opportunity to share them with you now. So the first one was coming to this realization where you shouldn't be asking why me, ask why not me. Why shouldn't it be me to solve this problem? Don't assume that someone else will be fixing it. We need as many diverse perspectives on problems that exist, and just as many diverse solutions. So, for example, women see problems that men don't see. Young people see problems that perhaps older people don't see. People of color see problems that white people don't see, etc. And so we need to be the ones creating those solutions for the problems that we see. So the second thing that I remember really vividly, like it was yesterday, is a conversation that I had with another woman in the program. I remember that at that time, I was feeling such a fear of failure, such a fear that if I tried to do something and it failed, it would be awful. And, you know, I would feel awful and look awful and all of that stuff. But I sat down in Kinfolk Cafe in Melbourne with this woman, and I realized that I was not the only one who was experiencing that. I looked at her, and you know, she was a bit older than me, and I could see that in her eyes as well. And then she said something to me that I will never forget. She said, you know what, you're so lucky you're young, because if you stuff up, no one will care. And I was like, what? And she said, well, I'm old and I can't get away with it anymore. So that was a change in perspective for me. And I thought, well, why not go for it now? Like, if I fail, I'll have learned so much and I'll be that much better at the next thing that I do. And I remember thinking, when I'm 30, I'll be doing something else and I'll have so much more to bring to it if I start learning from failure when I'm 20. And that time has come, and that's exactly what's happened. So the third main thing that I remember was my mentor sitting me down and just looking me in the eye and saying, Zoe, if anyone can truly do this, it's you. And I tell myself now this all the time. And so I would say it's always great to have a mentor who truly believes in you. So fast forwarding a couple more years from then, and I was, you know, a high energy, passionate young person running a successful NGO, and I felt like nothing could stop me. I was on top of the world. But unfortunately, something did stop me. I found myself in an abusive relationship. And this ground me to a complete halt. All of a sudden, I couldn't function. I lost all my confidence, I lost my passion, and I felt completely alone. Those were kind of the days before we had like TikToks about narcissistic abuse and social media accounts advocating for awareness about abusive relationships. It was really difficult for me to understand if I was alone in this experience. It was hard to find resources about what was happening. And after experiencing the reality of an ongoing abusive relationship where I experienced coercive control, emotional, financial, and social abuse, I realized that I never wanted anyone else to feel as alone as I did in that experience. And I had a realization that I would then dedicate my life to ending gender-based violence. So I started sharing my story. And when I did this, something magical started happening. When I shared my story, I noticed that other people came forward to share their stories. When I shared my story, I noticed that it helped other people feel less alone, and it helped me feel less alone as well. And when I shared my story, I could feel the shame in the room wither and die away. And that's when I became really passionate about the power of storytelling to end gender-based violence. I started practicing art and doing installation work, working with women survivors of gender-based violence to break down barriers of shame. And I did my master's thesis on the power of storytelling in processing trauma, which became what is now the PhD I'm working on in digital feminist activism. I started working in international development, and I became the gender advocacy advisor at Plan International. In that role, I started and led Free to Be, which was Australia's first ever crowdsourcing platform to collect experiences of street harassment. When I was leading Free to Be, the Me Too movement hadn't happened yet, so it was a bit of a different time. And many people told me that women would never want to share their stories online. It just wouldn't happen. And I thought to myself, I'm a young woman, I would share my story online. I reckon they're going to do it. And thousands of women share their stories on Free to Be. We ended up scaling the program to 5 continents around the world. Me Too happened, and we know that millions shared in the first 24 hours of that explosion of Me Too on Twitter. So it was through Free to Be that I really noticed the power of sharing stories online, but I also noticed something else. And this was that not only were women and non-binary people ready to share their stories online, but decision makers were ready to hear them, and they were desperate to access the data that they needed to address the problem. I noticed that there was a huge data gap when it came to gender-based violence. We know that around 9 in 10 women in Australia have experienced street harassment, and yet over 90% is never reported. So that means the decision makers can't access the data that they actually need to address the problem. So if you can't access data, you can't understand a problem. If you can't understand a problem, you can't fix it. So I then realized that I needed to build a bridge between survivors and legislators to find a common language between the two. So that's why I started She's a Crowd. I always envisioned She's a Crowd to be a safe reporting platform where people could share their experiences in a way that was not re-traumatizing and where they could feel a part of something bigger than themselves. And I envisioned it being a data-driven platform. Those stories would become invaluable data insights for government to access, so they could no longer turn a blind eye to the problem. The data's right there, literally on a map in front of them. So that's what we have at She's a Crowd. You can, at any time you'd like, log on to she'sacrowd.com and safely and anonymously report your experience. And that becomes important data that we use to work with decision makers. In my time doing this work, I've seen decision makers go from being completely blind to this issue to waking up and realizing that something needs to be done. I've seen victims become survivors, finding strength through sharing their stories. I've never underestimated the power of storytelling. And slowly I've seen the world catch up. Brittany Higgins, Grace Tame, Chanel Miller, these are all young women who've helped the world catch up. She's a Crowd consists of a team of people who are all under 30. And I am so proud of them and what we manage to do each and every day. We give survivors a voice and work towards a world where there are no more Aya Masawes, Courtney Herons, Hannah Clarks, Eurydice Dixons, Natalina Ancox, or Jill Mars. Our platform collects your stories every single day and turns those into valuable data for decision makers to address the problem using a preventative standpoint. And every single one of us deserves to feel safe traveling around, at home, at uni, at work, at school, everywhere in between. And we envision a world where every single person does. So thank you everybody for listening and giving me the opportunity to share my story. When I share my story, I feel powerful, and that's how I want every single person to be able to feel, especially anyone who's ever been made to feel small because of gender-based violence. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Zoe. Incredible presentation, and amazing to see how you're using your own personal story and scaling that up at a national level. I also want to thank all of the speakers, so Zoe, Ofeira, and Saji for sharing your personal experiences. You've probably not met any one of us in a physical room. You're all presenting to us online. So the strength, openness, and honesty that you've brought to this session, I want to thank you for it. And I know the participants here today want to thank you for it as well. We're going to kick off into Q&A. So I'm going to invite all of the speakers to turn your cameras and microphones back on. And the first question we're going to answer is, how can we center and utilize lived experience to create social connection? I feel like we've kind of touched on it in each of our presentations, but it would be great to unpack it a little bit more. So Zoe, you just presented, so why don't I hand that over to you first to take on?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I was just reading all of the lovely comments in the chat and I missed your question. Sorry.
No, that's okay. So the question is, how can we center and utilize lived experience to create social connection?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I love this. It's so important. And I think it's become a lot more, lived experience has become a valuable currency that's now much better understood than it was. I think about back when I take a gender lens to this, so happy if other people take a different lens as well. But I think back to, as I was saying, kind of when I was just embarking on this storytelling online kind of journey, and just the doubt that people had that it really mattered. And I think what I've always said is, you know, women have been sharing our experiences of gender-based violence for millennia, and often we share that anecdotally. And I think that a lot of the time that's why it's not taken seriously, because we all hear it, we all know it, we talk amongst ourselves, we get it. but then you try and talk to a decision maker about it and it's like, well, it's not reflected in the crime statistics, so it doesn't exist. And what I'm really passionate about doing is turning lived experience into something that will be taken seriously by decision makers and can be accessed as data. And honestly, it's amazing with, you know, it's so interesting. Like you can kind of say this is happening, you know, we all know people it's happened to, we are those people, you know, you can point to various research studies, but when you get an engineer who's been working in the field for 30 years and he's, you know, a bit jaded, and you show him a map with all of the stories on it, it's incredible the power it can have. And he's like, oh, wait a minute, I've got daughters. This might be happening to them. And it's like, yeah, you know, and so just how do we actually translate lived experience into something that can be used as data for change is, I think, a really interesting question, and something that I'm personally very passionate about doing. And I think it's one of the ways that we can actually use lived experience and center lived experience in the new emerging kind of world that's going to be dominated by data.
Thanks, Zoe. I might give the floor to Saji to take a tackle at this question, but from an international perspective, how can we use sort of lived experience at an international level as well?
Sure, thank you, Thomas. And thank you for the question as well. So I'm going to build on what Zoe just talked about. I think she framed it beautifully. Zooming out to at an international level, what I see is this the excitement about trying to make everything global and big. And oftentimes that's great. You know, content needs more people, more eyeballs, more data points. But sometimes small is as powerful and beautiful at the same time. So you can create niche communities where you share your narratives, share your experience, and create these support groups, create these power groups within your own smaller groups as well. So while it is important to think big and big numbers, sometimes it can get watered down, like we see in some Facebook groups, right? Where you have a smaller community that is much more focused. It can be very powerful for creating change, whether it's in the local community or in some other village somewhere else far away. So don't always get distracted by the big numbers, but also it starts locally with your own group that you have an affinity to. So that's one. I think the second, you know, I fully agree. The new currency is data, you know, and Zoe powerfully articulated that. Something that we are in the process of doing with the Global Fund is exploring ways, taking what the pandemic has taught us. The pandemic has taught us that people who own data are making so much more money than the people who are sharing that data with them. So the capitalist model has created a few wealthy people and a whole lot of other people much poorer. What if we flip that narrative? What if data can actually lead to a basic income model where everyday people who are sharing the data is getting it? So the Global Fund, one of the main things that we are looking at is creating the right mechanisms to monetize people's data with consent, that actually they get a basic income from it instead of somebody of one or two individuals profiting from it. So again, it's a disruptive effort, but I think that's another way to think about people's own stories and lived experience where they are getting not just a social value, but a monetary value as well. And just an additional way to think about that answer.
Thanks so much, Saji. That's really, really cool. And also a really great segue to Ofeira. I'm going to go to the next question, which is about young people and their trust in institutions. I know, Saji, you've already had a go at answering this, but Ofeira, I want you to talk a bit more about that incident that you spoke about and how you've been working with institutions, the schools and the young people and the communities to help rebuild trust and rebuild rapport. I think it would be really, really great for the whole group to share.
Cool. Well, I think a lot of the issues that our students are facing today, like at school and with school, like with leadership and all of that, like it's not new. It's not something new. It's something that their parents experienced and, you know, their grandparents, like systematic racism, discrimination, racism. Like, I think it's not anything new that they're dealing with when it comes to like these institutions and stuff like that. So they've kind of, I don't know, they've kind of created this barrier around them where they don't trust those systems, I guess. And I guess we have to kind of not exactly change the system, but adapt to it where it's suitable for, you know, people of color and culture, like, and not just, I don't mean to say it like this, but not just suited to white people, I guess. Like, you know, the systems that are put in place supposedly for our students and our youth and stuff like that, but it's not working for them. They're not exactly, it's not exactly what they're used to. Like, the systems that they have in place are based around their culture, their religion, their community, but I guess laws and all of that stuff and schooling, and like, it's just not for them, I guess. And like, a lot of kids will say it, like, school isn't for them because they're not learning what they want to learn. They're learning what they're being told to learn and stuff like that. I don't know what else to say, but
that's really
yeah,
great.
I guess that's really all I can say to that. Like, when it comes to our youth here in Shepparton, a lot of them are being discriminated against, and, you know, they get called like gorillas and stuff like that, and no one's doing anything about it. And it's from teachers that have been teaching over 30 years. So, you know, their elders have also had the same teachers and the same problems with those teachers, but nothing's been done to those teachers. And I guess all the consequences fall on the students more so than the leadership. And I guess we got to start from the bottom, or from the top down, instead of from the bottom where the students are. And yeah, I guess that's all.
That's really great. Thank you for sharing, Ofeira. And Saji, I'm going to throw it back to you. I know you've answered this question in the chat, but I want you to kind of relate that answer back to young people's trust in institutions, and whether young people do trust those institutions.
I think, I mean, I mentioned this earlier, you know, generally young people's trust in traditional institutions, whether it's government agencies, private sector, international NGOs, or local organizations, people have lost faith in them because they are not representing the values and aspirations of young people. And Ofeira really powerfully personalized this in a beautiful way, right? So there are two ways to think about this. One is, what is the legal and policy answer to this? And what is the personal answer to this? So they're both relevant. So this is another way to hold institutions accountable at a local level, whether it's the schools, school boards, or the private sector, or local governments. And at the same time, making sure that the narratives that are created around this are in a way that enables people to feel like they're being represented, their voice, you know, and there's another question also on this, and I can comment later on, but this is about people feeling excluded. How do you bring the exclusion to inclusion in an inclusive way without a checkbox exercise? So this is where that movement mindset is critical, not a project mindset is important, right? It's not mechanical, this is emotional. So these are things to keep in mind to balance these two efforts. But policy is so fundamental, because otherwise, if accountability is not there, this is only going to continue.
Thanks, Saji. Zoe, I'm going to bring you back to answer our next question. What do you suggest as the best way to approach building peaceful relationships and community between young people who've grown up in violence or have experienced violence?
Yeah, I actually think that what Ofeira said earlier was really important, and wanted to highlight it, where she spoke about the system, and the system not being like this system, but the system not being something that, you know, everyone trusts, because not everyone's had a good experience with it. And I think it's like, it cannot be underestimated how much that's the case. We see that all the time with the work that we do, because I think what we notice with gender-based violence is, obviously people aren't reporting, but the reasons that they're not reporting are different for different groups. And for more vulnerable groups, for people who are already discriminated against, this is exaggerated. And so there are like 4 key barriers that people face to reporting. These can include like internalization of the issue. So feeling like, self-blame, feeling like it's my own fault, I was wearing this, or, I was doing this. As well as issues such as like normalization in society of the issue, like, you just expect it, it's just normal, it's just part of, being, who you are, being a woman, being queer, whatever it is. And then also the mistrust of authorities and the perception that it's just too difficult to report. And I think that I just wanted to highlight those points because that's something where, people of colour in particular, Indigenous communities in particular, migrant communities, queer communities do not feel safe accessing the systems and the mechanisms that are in place supposed to be protecting them. But then we turn around and we blame them for not doing that. And what we try to do anyway to build that rapport is to remove those key barriers as much as possible, which involves a bit of a radical reframe of what reporting even looks like and what reporting even is, and what using that system, even can look like. And that involves having quite an imagination, which is something, having an imagination is something that we value really strongly at She's a Crowd, because we need to be able to imagine a better society and a better world in order to create one. Now I've gone on a tangent and I can't remember what you said again, but I hope I somewhat answered it.
Thomas speaking. It was about how do you engage and build peaceful relationships with people who've grown up in violence or experienced violence. I think you answered that great.
Yeah. Okay,
and I think I can segue to another question that's in the Q&A, which was, there's a couple of questions. What is your advice to young people wanting to get their message out there into the world? And how do you recommend we go about creating safe spaces where young people feel they can share their experiences without the pressure of having to report it? I'm going to hand it straight back to you, Zoe, and then you can hand it to another speaker.
Yeah, so the first question, how do you get your message out there? Yeah, I think one thing that really helped me was picking my battles, because there are so many issues. And I remember feeling like I was young and I was like, which social justice path should I take? Like, there's so many, like I care about so many things. And honestly, that lived experience of gender-based violence, because I originally was I grew up in Cambodia, ended up working in Cambodia, then, pivoted to feminism. But it was like, because I had that experience, it was so personal. It was like, this is my thing now. Like, this is what I'm going to just focus on. And that focus of that one issue, I trust that there are other people out there who are working super hard on all the other things I care about, but this is one thing that I, I'm going to do. And I think that focus is really important, and it's not always easy to find that. But, when you do focus, and then, the other one was, how can we share, it was kind of related to what I was previously saying, I think, which was like, I guess, society, what happens when you experience really a lot of things, but what we notice a lot, especially with sexual assault or anything like that, people say, did you report it, as the first thing. And I'm here to tell you, as someone who's experienced it, I've never reported anything to the police. And I've been challenged on that so many times, but I'm like, I have just perceived it as too difficult. It's not going to give me the justice I want anyway. We know that like more than 99% it doesn't go through, we don't get justice. And I'm doing this research at the moment for my PhD, and I'm looking at how and why women and non-binary people share stories of gender-based violence online. And almost every single one of my participants shared online because they had a bad experience reporting to the police. And some of them said that it was more traumatizing than the original experience. None of them felt heard or listened to or validated by the police. And it seemed like a bit of a luck of the draw, like you get an odd one that's good, that's been trained, but it's luck of the draw. And they turned to online space to actually seek the justice that they couldn't get through the systems, and they were actually using this term social jail, where they turned to online space to use it as a forum to warn other people of particular perpetrators, to learn about other victims of that same perpetrator, and to build a community of strength and support that could propel them into a safer future. And that's like something that I think is really, really interesting. But to answer the question, please share your story on She's a Crowd, because, you know, we would love to hear your feedback of what that experience is like for you. We've tried to design it to be as good an experience for you as possible, and we use it to work with decision makers. So
thanks, Zoe. I'm going to hand the next one to Ofeira. How do we appropriately include parents and families of students to open up discussions about the violence happening in the schoolyard without increasing the risk at home and without putting shame on the family? I'm going to hand it to Ofeira and then to Saji, and I'm going to try and squeeze in one more question before we close.
I think when the school brawl had happened over here, we didn't want to tackle it by ourselves. We wanted to work alongside the school because it did happen inside the schoolyard. And we also wanted to include the families because it is their children. Like, at the end of the day, they only go to school to learn and stuff like that. Like, their parents are standing there and they're, you know, thinking that they're safe and all of that. But, you know, other things happen and stuff. And I think what we did was we decided to have those community consultations. And for us, it was more the language that we use with our communities of people of color and culture. Like, it's a different type of language than how the school will speak. Like, the certain words and vocabulary that the school uses isn't exactly the language that our families of culture and color would want to hear. Like violence, harassment, stuff like that. Like, those big words aren't exactly what, you know, parents want to hear when it comes to their kids and stuff like that. So we went to kind of communicate it better with our families in a way that they will understand that, you know, the situations probably aren't as bad as the language that's being used. So a lot of our families were involved in you know, bridging the gaps and all of that and finding these solutions. And our students, they're learning now to open up more and speak up more. That incident that I was talking about before, our students had actually went to leadership to the principal and told them that it was going to happen, but nothing happened. Like, the teachers didn't do anything, I guess. And
sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off. And
no, that's all right.
Saji, just if you've got a couple of final words, and then I'll wrap the conversation up.
Sure, Tom. Thank you, Thomas. 3 points, capturing to some of the bigger questions that are there. First is, what we do and experience echoes through many generations. There was a comment about generational trauma, right? Just as much as the negative experience echoes through many generations, positive ones also echoes through many generations. So it's important to understand at a principal level how to balance those things out when you design programs. Second, it's this question about countering something versus addressing something. The more we counter something, more we give oxygen to the bad messaging, right? And we've learned through multiple sources with violent extremism, for example, that the more you counter this violent narrative, the more you're giving oxygen to the violent narrative itself and those who actually perpetrate that. So how do we create alternative narratives? This comes to the third point. In a sense of this is in the questions as well. While we might have adversary or strategies to organize, especially within movement mindsets, it's that, you know, you want to fight something, so you want to organize to fight. So from an organizing perspective, that would be an awesome principle. But to create results, whether it's policy change or practice change, behavior change, that requires a constructive approach. Because the more you're adversarial, the more people will fight you, especially men will fight you, right? So when it comes to gender-based violence or other, if you see men as the perpetrators, the more you're going down a path where you're blocking men from being the champions they can be. So same way, for constructive results, that tactic requires us to understand the grievances of the other, even if you don't agree with them. That requires a different tactic. So adversarial to organize, but to change systems, you need to have constructive approaches. So think about that as a principle as you think about this. So thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Awesome. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. If we were in a room, we'd be doing a huge round of applause, probably standing ovations, heaps of cheers. Thank you so much for being so open, sharing with us. There's a couple of things in the Menti chat. I'm going to hand it straight back to Cass to wrap us up and for some final housekeeping. But thank you so much again to all of our speakers.
Thanks, Tom, and thank you to all our speakers. In the chat, one of our session stewards will have shared a link to the Menti. And the question that we're asking at the moment is, how are you supporting, or how could you support young people to take action to build social connection and respectful relationships? Big thank you to all our panelists and to Tom for moderating this fantastic session. Just a brief reflection from me. I've been thinking a lot about a quote from the Talmud, which is, I'll probably get this wrong, but it's something along the lines of, you do not have to finish the work, but nor are you free to abandon it. And I think that speaks to what some of our panelists have been saying about tending your own garden, doing your own piece of work in your own corner of the world or corner of the community, and trusting that other people are doing similar work in different contexts all around the world. And knowing that you can't fix everything, but that doesn't mean that you can't fix something. You can't do everything, but that doesn't mean that you can't do something. Which I think is really important for us all to remember, and not try to take on too much, but also not abandon that vital work of building community. So I think one of the session stewards will be sharing the Menti results. We're going to have a short break after this session for about 15 minutes to transition to a new Zoom session. The next session will be called What We Wish You'd Do, and it's some insights from young people about what they want older people to do and how they want to receive support for the things that they're already doing. So thanks, everyone. A fantastic session. Thank you all for being here today.